Welcome to this week's edition of Good Books Radio. Audiobooks.com is the chief underwriter for Good Books Radio, which is produced by UTRGV Media Services for Rio Grande Valley Public Radio. And now, here's your host, Dr. W.F. Strong.
Welcome to Good Books Radio, where each week we bring you an interview with the author of a newly published hot book, one we hope you will want to read right away. Today's book is so good, you may want to stop in the middle of this interview to download it. As I was reading this book this week myself, my wife said that I left her a book widow, because every time I picked it up, she said I disappeared for 3 hours. And I would have read it all at once, except that there's a lot of it that's a bit difficult, and you have to take some time to digest it. The book is called Wolf Boys, Los Lobos, the story of two American teenagers and Mexico's most dangerous drug cartel, the story of Las Zetas, sicarios or assassins. It is by former Wall Street Journal staff writer Dan Slater. You may find it odd that a Wall Street reporter would take on writing about one of the most notorious drug cartels in Mexico, but it really makes sense because Las Zetas runs a multi-billion-dollar business. And they see it as a business, referring to themselves as La Compañía. Dan Slater, who will join us in just a moment, says that his questions were these. What is it like to work for a global drug trafficking operation? How do you get a job with one of these sorts of organizations? How do you apply for it? How do you climb the ladder? What is the psychology of a young assassin who kills daily? How does he get paid? How does he spend it? What kinds of women date him? And how does he relate to his friends, and how does he know who his friends are? Dan, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Bill. It's a pleasure to be on.
Well, I tell you, one of the things that you talk about throughout the book is the dangerous life journalists live in Mexico, and how many of them are on cartel payrolls, and when they disappoint, they are often taken out. You have written a book very unflattering of the cartels here. Are you nervous?
I would be lying if I said I wasn't scared or a little fearful during the writing process. Sure, I think that one thing that doing the book did for me was to make me appreciate that we live in a country where we are free to write about, say, the underworld, the criminal underworld. I did go to Mexico for research for the book, and specifically I went to Veracruz, where there's actually a cafe, a coffee house there. It's an old coffee house that's right on the water, and every morning at 8 a.m., all the media in town, all the journalists, the reporters, the radio people, the TV people, congregate at this old cafe. And it's there that all the news gathering is done. It's where all the politicians, the business folk come in the morning, and they basically tell the reporters what they're going to print that day. So when I went to Veracruz, I sat in that cafe for 2 days, and I interviewed a lot of reporters about their lives in Veracruz and how, the payoffs work, how they're essentially financed by the people that they're supposed to be reporting on. So as far as that information in the book, that's where I got that from.
I like that you make the point that the journalists on the payroll are supposed to turn a blind eye to, let's say there are 4 people killed in a bar in Acapulco, and a violent assassination of 4 people, let's say, and then the next day there's not supposed to be any mention of it. There's supposed to be a fascinating article about monarch butterflies or something quite different.
Exactly. It's sort of anyone's guess in a place like Veracruz what makes front page news on a given day.
How did you get access to this story?
I got access to this story originally through 2 avenues. One was through the Wolf Boys themselves, who are now in prison. Most of them are in prison in Texas, in the state prison system. Several of them are in the federal system, in which case they may be in Texas, but they could be anywhere in the country. So it was my letters with them, my visits with them, on the one hand. And then on the law enforcement side, it was all the research that I did in Laredo, Texas. I was going back and forth to Laredo for 3 years and meeting with all kinds of people there, largely law enforcement. The main homicide detective who pursued the boys when they began to commit murders in the United States, the DEA agents who pursued the Zetas during the sort of 2005, 2006 time period when all the spillover violence was happening, and also just met with people like the U.S. attorney who prosecuted the case, met with the people who ran the high schools where these kids went to school, their families, and so forth.
What kind of town is Laredo from your perspective?
Laredo is in many ways a great city. It's a small to mid-sized city of about 250,000. It's a fascinating city for a writer, for a journalist to go to, because it really is its own world. It's very marginalized. I feel like it's sort of neither here nor there. It's neither the United States, but it's not quite Mexico either. It feels very separate and apart from the rest of the country. It's one of the poorest cities in America. It's the least ethnically diverse city in America, 98% Hispanic. I think most notably, it's a huge center of commerce. It's the biggest overland port in the Western Hemisphere. They see about 60,000 trucks move through per week, and it really is a company town. It is a commerce site. The only problem is that a lot of that commerce is the underworld. A lot of that is the black market. So for a lot of those, impoverished folk in Laredo, that black market becomes sort of a magnet.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things you talk about in the book that was absolutely new to me is the concept of the plaza or the Zócalo of various cities that a cartel owns, and nothing moves without their say-so.
Yeah, so the plaza is a concept that will be familiar to people who follow the cartel news, or to people who've read a book about the cartel. It's essentially, it doesn't necessarily refer to the city center the way that plaza would traditionally. But it's more just who owns the town, who owns the hub through which the black market goods move. And the reason that's important is because if you own the turf, then you have the right to move the drugs or the illegal immigrants through, and you also have the right to tax other people who do it. Mm-hmm. So this is a very important concept.
Now, I was thinking that it must be, at some level, kind of stressful on the commander of the plaza, because he's got so many employees to take care of. You went through a lot of them, but I mean everything from collecting from the pharmacists who run legal pharmacies to the panteras. Who are the panteras?
The panteras are actually the females who work for the Zetas, and they can do all kinds of chores. From smuggling to, spying on the enemy.
Mm-hmm. And then who else, if we go through the list of employees, who else do we have working for the commander of the plaza?
I'm sorry?
I said, if we go through a list of the employees, you laid it out in the book, who else do we have that work for the commander of the plaza?
Oh, well, they have all kinds of people. You have the commandantes, you have who are kind of, the middle managers, you have your assassins who might be the boys, you have the women, you have the lookouts, who are often just the young boys who might sit in a window in the middle of the city, or might just walk down the sidewalks looking for the police who come through. You have your smugglers and so forth.
Something I found a really fascinating story is when you talked about Miguel Treviño, who was, he was like the number 3 guy in Las Zetas?
Miguel started off, originally he was a car washer for the bosses. That's the way a lot of guys start off, and that of course can imply all sorts of things. But yeah, I mean, eventually he was the guy who ran the plaza for Nuevo Laredo, and he then eventually ascended to the top of the cartel. He was ultimately arrested, apprehended in Mexico in 2013, and he's been in prison there ever since. And it was actually his arrest that inspired me to reach out to the boys when I did. I thought that since they had worked for him, he had been their boss, and in many ways, in sort of a weird way, almost kind of raised these boys to be like him. I thought, well, now that he's in custody, maybe, Gabriel and Bart, the boys at the center of Wolf Boys, would be more willing to open up to me about their lives.
Well, I must tell you, when I was reading the book, I was very happy at the end to learn that Miguel Treviño was in jail, because he's a real scary dude.
He is a very scary guy.
He said he killed 800 people.
Well, he told the Wolf Boys that he'd killed over 800 people back in 2005, and you have to remember that he didn't get apprehended until 2013, 8 years later.
So he would be the world's number one serial killer, I suppose, if you counted things that way.
Miguel must be the most brutal warlord ever. I can't think of anyone who would rival him. Maybe there is somebody out there, but he certainly was a bloodthirsty man.
I was going to talk about the story where I believe it was he who sent a team of assassins down to Acapulco to take out La Barbie, and he told them to lay low, stay in the hotel until they were ready to move, but being kids, they had to go out and party, and that was their undoing. I found it interesting that they would be recognized because of dress or style as being, Northerners, and that tipped off people who were watching to tell La Barbie, there's some guys here that you might find interesting.
Well, the clothes were a source of interest for me. I think, you at the beginning of the broadcast, you mentioned some of the questions that I set out to try to answer in the book, and I was interested in just the daily life, the customs, the kinds of food that people in the cartel ate, the clothes they wear, how the clothes marked them, marked off, their jobs and their sort of level within the cartel. This is a world that is so much about money and status. Not that the entire universe isn't the same way. We're all about that, right? The guy who lives up in New England who drives his Audi or his BMW, he's also very, sort of conscious of what that says about him. But the cartel world has very unique and particular status markers that I tried to kind of mark out in the book.
Yeah, I like the story you tell about the guy who did an assassination for Miguel, and then Miguel paid him his $10,000, and he said, "What do you want?" And he said, "What? I want a what?"
Well, he said he wanted an avalanche, but at first he wasn't sure. You're referring to a character in the book named Wences Tovar, who was one of the Wolf Boys, and when he started working for the cartel, when he did his first assassination in the U.S., he fled back to Texas and met Miguel, basically to tell Miguel, hey, I finished the job. And Miguel was sort of inducting him into the cartel. Now he said, okay, you are not a panachon, you are not a pussy, I will accept you. And he said, what do you want? And at first Wences thought he was referring to something like food, like, so I want some food. And he, everyone kind of laughed, and he said, no, you can have anything you want. And Wences said, well, he was probably 17, 18 at the time. He said, well, I don't have a car. And he said, what sort of a car do you want? And he said, well, I'd like an avalanche. So later that night, there was a brand new avalanche waiting in front of Wences's door. So these are the sorts of appeals that exist for a kid from a ghetto in Laredo who was raised with absolutely nothing, and then to kind of be plunged into this world where you're being asked, what sort of new vehicle do you want? How much cocaine would you like to have a good time? Everything is just available. So The bait, the allure, is very powerful, especially for a young boy, especially for a boy who comes from an impoverished background and seeks a sense of purpose, seeks a sense of belonging.
Well, you often, I'm glad you referred to the fashion, because over and over again they would get a big bunch of money, and then they would go to the mall and buy polo and, buy jewelry and buy clothes, Versace, and to them it was just, that was making it, the nice clothes and the nice car. That's really all they required.
Absolutely. I mean, these were boys who did not have a high school diploma, so their status, they didn't have a home, so their status was all about the car you drove, the clothes you wore. It was what was visible right now, what is visible today. So it was the Versace, the polo, having a cell phone was a very big deal, having a new car. At the end, Gabriel Cardona, who's the lead wolf boy in the book, he was driving around a Mercedes and taking it to, the mechanic to have it detailed, and he was very, very proud of that.
Oh, yeah. I like this part in the book where they rent a stash house, and Miguel has 3 or 4 other guys there with him, and he makes them mow the lawn, and he makes them clean, and he makes them make the place look nice, because he's not going to live in a dump.
Well, that to me was sort of a touching moment in the book. That was an aspect of Gabriel's personality that I found very human, mm-hmm. and that I found sort of moving, because as you know, because you've read the book, he was from a ghetto in Laredo. He grew up in a house that was sort of ramshackle, and he was embarrassed to take his girlfriend to meet his mother at the house because the paint was peeling, he said, and he constantly made these excuses for why he didn't want to bring the girlfriend to meet the mother, and really it was just he was embarrassed of the house where he lived. So now, later in the story, he's this sort of respected hitman for the cartel. He's renting a stash house on the north side of Laredo, the fancy side of Laredo, in this beautiful suburban street. It's a nice house. He's living there with these other boy assassins, and he kind of wants to take pride in the place where he's living, even if he's only going to be there for a few days or a week. He wants the lawn mowed. He doesn't want people leaving fast food bags in the kitchen. He wants the thing to be neat. So, to me, that was a very interesting part of his personality.
Well, I guess all of these guys are kind of a ragbag of contradictions, because you have Miguel Treviño, who is the, master assassin, the genocide artist almost, and
the genocide artist. There you go.
Yeah. and he, but he goes to church every Sunday with his mother.
Yeah, wasn't that amazing?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there are just certain, and it's hard to, why does he go to church every Sunday with his mother? I who knows? Is it for looks? Is it for appearances? Is it because he's genuinely religious? Is it possible to be religious if you're killing dozens of people a day?
Yeah, but they were all bad.
Well, he was killing people who weren't necessarily innocent, but that's a whole other conversation. Are the children of a cartel member, are they innocent, are they not innocent? Is it possible to not be innocent if you're 10 years old? Yeah.
No, I'm not making any excuses for him. I'm just saying what they tend to say is they were
absolutely.
soldiers in a war, and they were viable targets. But
absolutely, and you know what? Even the homicide detective in the book, his name is Robert Garcia. The first time that I met Robert, we were spending time together. One of the first things I asked him, I said, what do you think of the victims? What do you think of the people that the Wolf Boys assassinated here in Laredo? And he said, excuse my language here, but he said, they're all pieces of shit. Mm-hmm. And this is a guy who's pretty empathetic to human suffering. He's seen a lot of it, and he wouldn't say something like that lightly. But if he felt that way, then how do the Wolf Boys feel? I mean, they have even less regard, obviously, and so they could rationalize, say, a pregnant wife of one of their targets getting in the way and catching a bullet, which actually happened one time.
Well, I've given some thought to the idea of the semi-religious nature of mafiosos, because you go back to the original mafia in Italy, a lot of them were very religious. They went to church. They gave huge amounts of money to the church. And I wonder if there isn't this idea that they can bribe their way into the pearly gates. I mean, they can pay their way through everything else, so maybe they can balance out their sins.
Well, maybe it's that. I think maybe it's also a sense of being able to bribe your way into the good graces of the community. If you can appear publicly to share the pieties of, the citizens around you, the people who have to sit there and abide your behavior, have to abide your business. It's not enough to just give back money. You need to, appear to care what they care about. So, maybe that's why Miguel went to church with his mother every Sunday.
Well, a lot of those nautical guys have a reputation, as you point out, for being Robin Hoods, that they are brutal with people, but they are very good and generous with everyday people. I mean, they're brutal with the bad guys, as many people see it, and then they're generous with good people.
As long as you don't threaten my power, I'm okay with you. I mean, this is the and it's a very fragile, sensitive ego. It's very easy to run afoul of that ego, of that power, and wind up on the wrong side. And this is sort of the Donald Trump approach to governing.
Well, what about in terms of the assassinations themselves? I found it rather disturbing that the going price for an assassination was $10,000.
Well, in Mexico, if you're talking about a Mexican wolf boy, the price might be, even less. These were $10,000 apiece for the murders committed in the U.S. and in Mexico, but that was the price paid to American wolf boys. I mean, it might even be less. And it can also be more. The price is often pegged to the importance of the target, and the reason that is because a person who's higher up in the hierarchy, A, they might be harder to kill, and B, if you do succeed in killing them, there's a bigger chance of blowback.
Yeah. Well, like your police officer, Robert, he had a $500,000 bounty, didn't he? Yep,
that came up. That was information that came out of an informant interview. Actually, a couple informant interviews, and there was, a price on his head. So that was a very intense and dramatic part of the story. And there was actually there's a story told in the book during the time period there where Robert knew that there was a price on his head, and he was having Laredo Police Department squad cars watching his house at night, and he and his wife were obviously not doing very well because she wasn't thrilled that she was married to a guy who was now a target of the cartel that basically operated a mile away from their house across the border. There was an evening where his son's best friend was sleeping over. He woke up in the middle of the night, and he used the wrong bathroom, and Robert almost shot him in the head.
Well, actually, that's, very much related to that is the frightening aspect of these assassins getting the wrong guy quite often.
Yeah, because oftentimes they kind of didn't have very solid intelligence. They were like, well, the guy drives a blue car, or the guy drives a blue, Hummer.
The blue Hummer. That's a great story.
And so then they'd see a guy. Well, maybe he's driving a blue Ford Explorer. They're like, well, I guess that's close enough, And you have to remember that these are kids.
Mm-hmm.
These are 16, 17, 18-year-old kids who certainly don't have fully developed consciences, or some would say they don't have consciences at all. But they also don't have a great sense of organization. They're impatient, and they don't have a sense of consequence. Gabriel got arrested several times in the U.S., and two of the three times he was arrested in the U.S., it was actually for a homicide. All three times he was arrested, he ended up getting out on bail, and he'd go right back out and join the business again. So there was a sense of the somewhat faulty or totally faulty, however you want to look at it, justice system in the U.S. reinforcing the culture of impunity that he had learned very well in Mexico.
That shocked me that this guy would be under suspicion and having pretty good evidence against him for at least being an accomplice in murders, and he would get out. I couldn't believe that.
Yeah, I think in a place like Laredo, where it's a city that essentially runs on crime in many respects, you have overburdened prison systems up the wazoo. I mean, the state, the local jail, the state prisons, the federal prisons, it's all just overloaded. The youth detention centers, and so even for homicide, it's pretty rare for someone not to get offered bail, which is bizarre to me, but every lawyer in Laredo I spoke to reinforced that notion that, it's very rare when someone gets arrested and put in jail for homicide, it's very rare for them not to get bail. So when you have these people who do homicide for a living, not that that's necessarily going to come out in the investigation, but when you have people doing homicide for a living, most of the time they're going to get out.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that is really frightening at some level. Was Gabriel a smart guy? I mean, he seemed to me a kid who had a good native intelligence about him.
Very intelligent, and he was very promising as a youngster. This was a kid who would earn awards in his math and English classes when he was in middle school. He was the quarterback of his junior high football team. He showed up to Sunday school every Sunday. This was a kid who, if you looked at him when he was 13, 14 years old, you might say, this is a kid who's going somewhere. This will be one of those Laredo kids who actually winds up somewhere other than prison. And in fact, he wanted to be an architect or a lawyer when he was a kid. And what happened is he started growing up, and he got to high school. He was benched on the football team. That was a strange experience for him because he'd been used to so much success, and so he decided to quit the football team. And if you don't, stay occupied as a youngster in Laredo, it's very easy to wind up hanging out in the streets.
Yeah.
And so in a matter of days, he's hanging out with a local street gang. And things spiraled from there very quickly. Started off with smuggling guns and vehicles across down to Mexico, running the drugs north, and it was actually through the vehicle smuggling, which he was very good at because he would take these sedatives, these tranquilizers, which would basically negate all his inhibitions. He could walk into the parking lot of a gas station, look for someone who'd left their car on while they go in to pay, hop in, take it, and drive it to Mexico. He could get $500 a car and $1,000 for an SUV in Mexico. He was doing a lot of that, and it was actually through that sideline that he met the Zetas.
Well, it's certainly a cautionary tale and a frightening story about how these cartels work from the inside out. So I thank you so much for the book. I'm sorry we're out of time, but it has been a fascinating conversation.
Bill, thank you so much for having me on. I will do it any time and hope to speak to you for my next book.
Okay, just hang on there. Let me wrap this up. That's it for this episode of Good Books Radio. As always, if you would like to hear this again on podcast, you can get it on our Facebook page, or on our YouTube channel, Good Books Radio. And if you'd like to write to us at any time, you can write to goodbooksradioshow@gmail.com. For Good Books Radio and audiobooks.com, I'm Dr. W.F. Strong. Here's hoping that all your books are good reads.